Sometimes the most broken hearts find each other in the most unexpected ways. In a world that had forgotten kindness, a little girl and a lonely man were about to discover that love doesn't always come wrapped in pretty packages. The mountain man, Bram McCready, was feared by everyone in Cedar Falls. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with wild hair and deep scars, he came to town only when necessary. So when 6-year-old Lottie stood on the auction block that October morning, nobody expected the giant to step forward. The child was silent, her small frame lost in a tattered dress, her eyes holding sadness no child should carry. When Bram's voice cut through the crowd, everything changed. But would this broken child and this feared man heal each other's wounds, or would fear destroy their chance at happiness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, a frontier town that had seen better days and harder times. Wooden buildings lined the thoroughfare like weathered sentinels, their paint peeling from countless seasons of mountain winds and unforgiving weather. The town existed in that precarious space between civilization and wilderness, where survival often mattered more than sentiment, and kindness was a luxury few could afford. At the far end of Main Street, a crowd had gathered around a makeshift platform, nothing more than old shipping crates stacked together and covered with a moth-eaten blanket. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, mixed with the less pleasant odors of unwashed bodies and nervous sweat. This was auction day, but not for livestock or household goods. Today, Cedar Falls was conducting its most shameful business, the auctioning of orphaned children to whoever could pay for their keep. Bram McCready had descended from his mountain sanctuary that morning with no intention of participating in such proceedings. At nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and hands that could span a dinner plate, he cut an imposing figure against the autumn landscape. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, streaked with premature gray from too many hard winters and harder memories. Deep lines etched his weathered face, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a life he rarely spoke about. The townspeople gave him a wide berth as he made his way down the street. Mothers pulled their children closer, and men found sudden interest in their boots when his pale blue eyes swept over them. To most of Cedar Falls, Bram McCready was more legend than man, a hermit who lived somewhere high in the mountains, appearing in town only when absolutely necessary to trade pelts for supplies. Stories followed him like shadows. Some said he'd been a soldier once, others whispered he was running from the law. The truth was simpler and more painful than any of their wild tales, but Bram had never been one to correct their assumptions. He'd come to town that day for salt and coffee, nothing more. His cabin was well stocked for winter, and he preferred to limit his contact with civilization to the bare minimum. But as he approached Henley's general store, the sound of the auctioneer's voice stopped him cold. Next we have little Charlotte. Lottie, they call her. 6 years old. Healthy as far as we can tell, though she don't speak much. Came to us from the territorial orphanage when it closed down last month. Against his better judgment, Bram found himself turning toward the crowd. Through the gaps between bodies, he caught sight of a small figure standing on the platform. The child looked impossibly tiny against the backdrop of adult faces, her thin frame swimming in a dress that had once been blue, but now bore the grey-brown patina of too many washings and not enough care. Her dark hair hung in limp strands around a face that should have been round with childhood, but instead appeared gaunt with premature knowledge of the world's cruelties. What struck Bram most were her eyes, large and dark, holding a depth of sadness that no 6-year-old should possess. She stood perfectly still, her small hands clasped in front of her, neither crying nor pleading. There was a resigned quality to her posture that spoke of someone who had learned not to hope for better treatment, only for an end to the current humiliation. She's small for her age, but she'll grow, the auctioneer continued, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man selling livestock. Good for light work around the house, and she don't eat much. What am I bid for this little one?" The crowd murmured among themselves, but no hands went up immediately. Bram noticed several of the local farmers eyeing the child with calculating expressions, no doubt weighing the cost of feeding her against the value of extra hands for chores. Mrs. Pemberton, who ran the town's boarding house, whispered something to her husband that made him shake his head firmly. "Come now, folks," the auctioneer pressed. "Someone's got to take the child. Can't have her wandering the streets come winter." A voice from the back called out, "What about her history? We got a right to know what we're getting." The auctioneer consulted a piece of paper. "Says here her parents died of fever 3 years back. Been in the territorial orphanage since then. Quiet child, no trouble, knows her letters some. Why don't she speak?" Another voice demanded. "Some children go quiet after tragedy," came the diplomatic reply. "Nothing wrong with her that a firm hand and regular meals won't cure." Bram felt something twist in his chest as he watched the proceedings. The child, Lottie, never moved, never looked at the crowd. She stared straight ahead with the blank expression of someone who had learned to disappear inside herself. It was a look he recognized, one he'd seen in his own reflection too many times to count. $5, came a gruff voice from the left. Bram turned to see Jake Morrison, a farmer known for working his hired hands near to death. The man had buried 2 wives and driven off 3 sons with his brutal temper. $5, I hear," the auctioneer announced. "Do I hear 10? Silence stretched across the crowd. $5 was a substantial sum for most of the town's residents, especially for a child who wouldn't be able to do heavy labor for several years yet. "Going once for $5, the auctioneer called. Bram found himself studying Lottie's face more intently. Even at 6 years old, he could see she understood what was happening. There was a subtle tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible straightening of her already rigid posture. She knew Jake Morrison by reputation, just as everyone in town did. Going twice, $20. The words left Bram's mouth before he fully realized he'd spoken them. The crowd turned as one, faces registering shock at both the voice and the amount. $20 was more than most men in Cedar Falls made in a month. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then recovered his composure. $20 from Mr. McCready. Do I hear 25? Jake Morrison shot Bram a venomous look, but made no counteroffer. The crowd muttered among themselves, speculation running wild about the mountain man's sudden interest in acquiring a child. For her part, Lottie turned her head slightly and looked directly at Bram for the first time. Their eyes met across the crowd, and he saw something flicker in her dark gaze. Not hope exactly, but perhaps a tiny lessening of despair. $20 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. He paused, scanning the crowd for any last-minute bids. Sold to Mr. McCready for $20. The crowd began to disperse, but not before shooting curious and concerned glances in Bram's direction. He could already hear the whispers starting, speculation about his motives ranging from the charitable to the sinister. Let them talk, he thought grimly. They'd been talking about him for years anyway. As people moved away, Bram approached the platform where Lottie still stood. The auctioneer climbed up to escort her down, but Bram stepped forward first. I'll take her, he said quietly. The official hesitated, then shrugged. Money first, as agreed. Bram reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, counting out $20 silver into the man's palm. The transaction complete, he turned his attention to the child. Come along then, he said. His voice gentler than any in the crowd had ever heard it. Lottie climbed down from the platform with careful dignity, her movements precise and controlled. She was even smaller up close, the top of her head barely reaching Bram's waist. Someone had attempted to clean her up for the auction, but soap and water couldn't hide the evidence of too little food and too much neglect. You got anything to collect? Bram asked. She shook her head silently. All right then. As they walked toward the edge of town, where Bram had left his horse and pack mule, the weight of curious stares followed them. Bram was accustomed to being watched, but having Lottie beside him seemed to intensify the scrutiny. He could feel the judgment in every gaze, the speculation about what a man like him wanted with a little girl. The truth was simpler and more complicated than anything they might imagine. 23 years ago, Bram had been a different man with a different name, living in a settlement not unlike Cedar Falls, with a wife he'd loved more than his own life, and a daughter with dark hair and serious eyes. That life had ended in blood and smoke, leaving him with nothing but guilt and an endless ache where his heart used to be. He'd never intended to bid on the child, had never intended to take responsibility for another human being ever again. But when he'd seen her standing there with that look of resigned despair, something in his chest had cracked open like ice breaking up in spring. Maybe it was the way she held herself, small but somehow dignified. Maybe it was the silence that surrounded her like armor. Or maybe it was simply that he recognized in her the same bone-deep loneliness that had been his constant companion for more than 2 decades. Whatever the reason, he'd spoken without thinking, and now he was responsible for a 6-year-old girl who looked at the world through eyes that had seen too much. As they reached his horse, a steady bay mare named Sage, Bram realized he had no idea what he was doing. He'd survived alone in the mountains for over 20 years, but caring for a child was territory as foreign to him as the ocean depths. "Can you ride?" he asked. Lottie shook her head. "All right. You'll ride with me then." He lifted her carefully onto Sage's back, settling her in front of the saddle, then swung up behind her. She sat perfectly still, her small body tense with uncertainty. As they began the long journey up the mountain toward his cabin, Bram wondered what in God's name he'd gotten himself into. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, the autumn leaves creating a carpet of gold and red beneath the horses' hooves. The air grew thinner and cleaner as they climbed, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. It was a 3-hour ride to Bram's cabin, and for the first hour neither of them spoke. Finally, as they paused to rest the horses at a stream crossing, Bram broke the silence. "I suppose you're wondering why I bid on you," he said. Not looking at her directly, Lottie said nothing, but he felt her slight nod. "Truth is, I'm not entirely sure myself. But you don't need to be afraid. I won't hurt you, and I won't work you like some kind of servant. You're just a child, and children deserve better than what was about to happen to you down there." She turned in the saddle to look at him then, studying his scarred face with those 2 old eyes. He met her gaze steadily, letting her see whatever she needed to see. "My cabin's not much," he continued, "but it's warm and dry and there's always food. You'll have your own space, and if you decide you want to leave when you're older, I won't stop you. But for now, it's the best I can offer." Something in her expression softened slightly, though she still didn't speak. As they continued up the mountain, Bram found himself pointing out landmarks. A lightning-struck pine that marked the halfway point, a meadow where deer came to graze in the evenings, the distant peak where eagles nested. He wasn't sure why he was sharing these details with a child who might not even be listening, but her presence seemed to draw words from him like warmth drew sap from trees. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Bram's home sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines and backed by a granite cliff face. It was larger than most mountain cabins, built with the skill of a man who'd had nothing but time and solitude to perfect his craft. The heavy oak door bore protective symbols he'd carved during long winter nights, not from any belief in their power, but simply because the repetitive work had helped quiet his mind. As he helped Lottie down from the horse, she noticed the carvings and traced one with a small finger. "Old habits," Bram said gruffly. "Learned that from my father back in Pennsylvania. Probably doesn't mean anything, but it can't hurt." Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a thick bearskin rug spread before it. Simple wooden furniture filled the space, a table and chairs, a few shelves lined with books, a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. Everything was clean and well-maintained, speaking to the discipline of a man who'd found order in solitude. "You can have the loft," Bram said. gesturing to a ladder that led to a small sleeping area under the eaves. "I'll fix up a proper bed for you tomorrow. But for tonight there's blankets and a pillow up there." Lottie climbed the ladder with the careful movements of someone accustomed to making do with whatever shelter was available. Bram watched her explore the small space, noting how she examined every corner as if cataloguing potential escape routes. It was behavior he recognized, the caution of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary and trust was dangerous. As darkness settled over the mountains, Bram prepared a simple meal of salt pork, beans, and biscuits. He called up to Lottie when it was ready, and she descended the ladder with the same careful precision. They ate in silence, though he noticed she cleaned her plate completely, despite her small appetite. It had probably been some time since she'd had a full meal. After supper, as Bram banked the fire for the night, Lottie surprised him by approaching the bookshelf. She stood on her toes, trying to see the titles on the higher shelves. "You can read?" he asked. She nodded. "Well then." He pulled down a volume of poetry, Longfellow, worn soft from many readings. "This might interest you. Take it up to the loft if you like." She accepted the book with something approaching reverence, holding it carefully against her chest as she climbed back up to her temporary bed. A few minutes later, he heard the soft sound of pages turning overhead. As Bram settled into his own bed that night, he listened to the familiar sounds of the mountain, wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the settling of logs in the fireplace. But underneath it all was something new, the quiet breathing of a child in the loft above. It was a sound he hadn't heard in his home for over 20 years, and it stirred memories he'd thought safely buried. He'd built this cabin as a fortress against the world and his own past, a place where he could exist without inflicting his damage on others or having theirs inflicted on him. Now, in the space of a single day, that solitude had been breached by a silent 6-year-old girl who looked at the world through eyes that had seen too much. As sleep finally claimed him, Bram wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, not in taking Lottie from that auction block, but in thinking he was capable of caring for another human being. His last conscious thought was of his own daughter, Sarah, who would have been about Lottie's age when the Comanche raiders came. Perhaps this was some kind of penance, a chance to save the child he couldn't save before. Or perhaps it was simply an old fool's desperate attempt to fill a hole in his heart that had been bleeding for 23 years. Bram woke before dawn to the sound of whimpering from the loft above. The soft, distressed noises pulled him from the deep sleep he'd grown accustomed to over years of mountain solitude. For a moment he lay still, unsure how to respond. He'd dealt with wounded animals before, but a frightened child was territory he hadn't navigated in more than 2 decades. The whimpering stopped, replaced by the kind of silence that spoke of someone holding their breath, trying to make themselves invisible. Bram recognized that particular quality of quiet. He'd perfected it himself during the worst nights after Sarah's death. When even breathing felt like too much noise for the world to bear, he rose carefully, his joints protesting the mountain cold that had settled overnight. Moving as quietly as his large frame allowed, he climbed the ladder to check on Lottie. The loft was small, barely tall enough for him to stand upright, but it was warm and dry. Moonlight filtering through the single window revealed a small figure huddled under the blankets he'd provided. Lottie was awake, her dark eyes reflecting the pale light. She clutched something against her chest with desperate intensity, though in the dim light, Bram couldn't make out what it was. When she saw him, she went perfectly still, like a rabbit that had spotted a predator. "Bad dream?" he asked softly. She didn't respond, but he saw her slight nod. "I get those too sometimes." He settled himself at the top of the ladder, careful not to crowd her small space. "Want to tell me about it?" Lottie shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. She held up the object she'd been clutching, a small, battered cloth doll. Even in the moonlight, Bram could see it had been well-loved and poorly cared for. One arm hung by a few threads, the face was stained and faded, and stuffing leaked from several seams. It was the kind of toy that spoke of poverty and hard use, but also of a child's fierce attachment to the one thing that was truly hers. "That's a fine doll," Bram said, though his heart ached at the sight of it. "What's her name?" Lottie's lips moved, but no sound came out. She tried again, then gave up with visible frustration. Instead, she held the doll closer and pointed to its damaged arm. "Ah, she's hurt." Bram nodded, understanding. "Well, I'm not much of a seamstress, but I know my way around a needle and thread. Spent enough time mending my own clothes and gear. Would you like me to take a look at her?" The internal struggle was visible on Lottie's face. The doll was clearly precious to her, but it was also falling apart. Trust warred with desperation in her expression. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she extended the toy toward him. Bram accepted the doll with the gravity he might have shown receiving a sacred relic. Up close, he could see the extent of the damage: loose limbs, torn seams, fabric worn thin from countless nights of frightened clutching. But he could also see the careful attempts at previous repairs, stitches that were crooked but determined, patches cut from other scraps of cloth. "Someone tried to fix her before," he observed. Lottie nodded, then pointed to herself. "You did this work?" At her nod, Bram felt a surge of admiration. "That's fine sewing for someone your age. You did good work with what you had." He examined the loose arm more closely. "But I think she needs some reinforcement, and maybe some new stuffing. I've got proper thread downstairs, and I believe there's some clean cotton batting I use for cleaning my rifle." He started to rise, then paused. "I'll be right back, and I'll be very careful with her. I promise." Lottie watched him descend the ladder with the kind of intense attention reserved for life-or-death matters. Bram gathered his sewing kit, a small leather case that had belonged to his wife Mary, along with scissors, cotton batting, and a lamp. When he returned to the loft, Lottie had arranged herself so she could watch his every movement. Working by lamplight, Bram began the delicate process of repairing the doll. His large hands, scarred and calloused from decades of hard work, moved with surprising gentleness as he reinforced the loose arm with careful stitches. He worked slowly, both because precision was required and because he sensed this was as much about building trust as fixing a toy. "I had a daughter once," he said quietly as he worked, not looking at Lottie directly. "Her name was Sarah. She had a doll too, though not as well-traveled as this one. Called her Miss Beatrice, though I never did figure out why." His voice caught slightly. "Sarah would have been about your age, I think, when I lost her." Lottie leaned closer, watching his careful stitches. The revelation seemed to have sparked something in her, a recognition perhaps of shared loss. "This doll of yours," Bram continued, threading his needle with fresh cotton. "She's seen some hard times, hasn't she? But look here." He showed Lottie how he was reinforcing the arm attachment. "The damage doesn't make her less precious. Sometimes the things that have been broken and mended are stronger than they were before." As he worked, stuffing the doll's body with fresh cotton and closing the torn seams, Lottie gradually relaxed. She even leaned against his shoulder at one point, a gesture of trust that nearly undid him. The contact was so light he might have imagined it, but the warmth of her small form beside him was real enough. "There," he said finally, holding up the repaired doll. "Good as new. Maybe better." The transformation was remarkable. The doll's limbs were secure, her body properly filled, and while the stains and faded fabric remained, she looked loved rather than abandoned. Lottie accepted her back with something approaching reverence, testing the previously loose arm and finding it solid. For the first time since he'd seen her on the auction block, Lottie smiled. It was a small, tentative expression, but it transformed her entire face. The haunted look didn't disappear, but it receded enough to let Bram glimpse the child she might have been under different circumstances. "Better?" he asked. She nodded emphatically, then surprised him by reaching out and briefly touching his hand where it rested on his knee. The contact lasted only a moment, but it felt like a tentative bridge across the vast distance between them. "Well then," Bram said, suddenly feeling awkward in the face of her gratitude. "You should try to get some more sleep. Morning comes early in the mountains." As he gathered his sewing supplies and prepared to leave the loft, Lottie caught his sleeve. When he turned back, she pressed the doll against her cheek, then pointed to him and nodded. It took him a moment to understand. She was thanking him, showing him that the doll was better, that his help had mattered. "You're welcome," he said gruffly, his throat unexpectedly tight. Back in his own bed, Bram lay awake listening to the silence from the loft. The whimpering didn't return, and eventually he heard the soft, steady breathing of peaceful sleep. But rest eluded him as memories stirred like sediment in still water. Sarah had been 7 when the Comanche war party swept through their settlement. Bram had been away, tracking down stolen cattle with a group of men from the neighboring homesteads. They'd been gone 3 days when they saw the smoke on the horizon and knew they were too late. By the time they reached the settlement, there was nothing left but ashes and bodies. He'd found Mary in the ruins of their cabin, having died defending their daughter. But Sarah was gone, taken or killed. He'd never known for certain. He'd spent months searching, following every rumor and reported sighting, but the trail had gone cold in the vastness of the frontier. Eventually, the other survivors had convinced him to give up, to start over somewhere else. But starting over had meant abandoning hope, and abandoning hope had felt like abandoning Sarah all over again. So instead, he'd run, changed his name, headed for the mountains, and built himself a fortress where the past couldn't follow. For 23 years it had worked, until today, when a silent 6-year-old girl with a broken doll had cracked open something he'd thought permanently sealed. The next morning brought the practical realities of his new situation into sharp focus. Lottie climbed down from the loft, carrying her repaired doll, but she was still wearing the same thin dress from the auction, inadequate clothing for mountain temperatures that would soon turn deadly. "We need to get you some proper clothes," Bram said over breakfast. "Winter comes fast up here, and what you're wearing won't keep you warm when the snow starts." Lottie nodded but said nothing. She ate her porridge slowly, savoring each bite in a way that suggested she wasn't accustomed to knowing when her next meal might come. "I'll have to make another trip to town," Bram continued, thinking aloud. "Get cloth and such. Unless," he studied her thoughtfully, "can you sew? More than just doll repair, I mean." She nodded eagerly, then seemed to catch herself and became more subdued. "Well then, that'll help. I'm handy with leather and such, but regular sewing's not my strong suit." He pushed back from the table. "Come on then. Let me show you around the place properly." The tour of Bram's mountain sanctuary revealed the extent of his solitary life. A root cellar carved into the hillside held preserves and dried goods enough to last through the harshest winter. A workshop attached to the cabin contained tools for every conceivable task: woodworking, metalwork, leather crafting. Behind the cabin, a small barn housed Sage and the pack mule, along with chickens that provided eggs and the occasional dinner. What struck Lottie most, though Bram didn't realize it, was the complete absence of anything feminine. This was a place built by a man who'd expected to live and die alone, with no concessions to comfort beyond the purely practical. The few decorative touches, carved wooden bowls, a quilt on the bed, spoke of skills learned from necessity rather than joy. As they walked the perimeter of the clearing, Lottie stopped beside a patch of ground near the cabin's eastern wall. The soil here was richer, less rocky than the surrounding area, and Bram realized she was examining what had once been Mary's garden. He'd let it go wild after coming to the mountains, but the basic structure remained: raised beds outlined with fitted stones, a trellis that had once supported climbing beans. Lottie knelt and brushed away fallen leaves, revealing the dried stalks of herbs that had managed to survive without tending. She looked up at Bram with a question in her dark eyes. "My wife's garden," he said quietly. "Or it was, a long time ago. Been meaning to clear it out properly, but," he shrugged, "never seemed important enough." Lottie stood and walked the length of the garden beds, her movements thoughtful and assessing. When she reached the end, she turned back to Bram and nodded firmly, as if reaching some internal decision. "You want to try gardening?" he asked, another emphatic nod. "Well, it's late in the season for planting much, but come spring." He stopped, realizing what he'd just implied. Come spring assumed she'd still be here. that this arrangement would last beyond the immediately practical need to keep her fed and sheltered through winter. The thought should have alarmed him. Instead, as he watched Lottie carefully examining the abandoned garden with the serious attention of someone planning improvements, Bram felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a tentative stirring of hope for the future. That afternoon, as clouds gathered over the high peaks promising the first snow of the season, Bram began making lists of what they'd need for winter. Warm clothes for Lottie topped the priority, followed by additional food stores and perhaps some books more suitable for a child. He found himself planning as if she were a permanent addition to his mountain stronghold, and the ease with which he made that mental adjustment surprised him. When evening came, he built up the fire and settled into his rocking chair with the worn volume of Longfellow. To his surprise, Lottie approached with her own book, one she'd selected from his shelf, and curled up on the bearskin rug nearby. They read in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the mountains. Two solitary souls finding unexpected peace in shared quiet. But as Bram glanced over at Lottie, absorbed in her reading with her repaired doll beside her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this fragile peace was temporary. The world had a way of intruding on sanctuaries, and he'd learned the hard way that happiness was often just tragedy taking its time to arrive. Still, for tonight at least, the cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The first weeks of Lottie's presence in Bram's mountain sanctuary brought a series of small adjustments that felt monumental to a man who'd lived alone for over 2 decades. Simple routines that had become as natural as breathing, eating when hungry, sleeping when tired, speaking only to his animals, suddenly required consideration of another human being's needs and rhythms. Bram discovered that caring for a 6-year-old girl involved 1,000 tiny decisions. He'd never anticipated how much food to prepare when someone ate portions the size of a sparrow's appetite. How to heat enough water for washing when cleanliness seemed to matter more to children than to solitary mountain men. How to gauge whether silence meant contentment or distress when the child in question communicated primarily through gestures and expressions. Lottie, for her part, moved through the cabin and its surroundings with the careful attention of someone mapping escape routes and safe spaces. She tested the solidity of floorboards before putting her full weight on them, examined the locks on doors and windows with casual thoroughness, and positioned herself where she could see both Bram and the exit whenever possible. It was behavior born of hard experience, and Bram recognized it because he'd once done the same thing. The mountain winter arrived earlier than usual that year, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wilderness of white silence. Bram had made 2 more trips to Cedar Falls for supplies, each journey watched by curious eyes and accompanied by whispered speculation about his motives. He'd purchased wool fabric, needles, thread, and patterns for children's clothing, transactions that had the town seamstress asking pointed questions about his domestic arrangements. Awful lot of material for someone living alone. Mrs. Henley had observed while cutting the cloth, "Winter requires preparation." Bram had replied evenly, offering no additional explanation. Back at the cabin, Lottie had thrown herself into the task of sewing with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Her small fingers moved with surprising skill as she cut patterns and assembled seams, creating warm dresses, thick stockings, and a heavy coat that would keep her safe through the mountain cold. Watching her work, Bram gained new appreciation for the resourcefulness that had kept her alive in circumstances that would have broken many children. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" he asked one evening as she hemmed a sleeve by firelight. Lottie paused in her work and pointed to herself, then made a gesture that suggested teaching herself through observation and necessity. "No one taught you?" She shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. She held up her fingers, first 1, then 2, then 3, and made a pulling motion that Bram eventually recognized as thread being drawn through fabric. "You learned by watching?" "Watching who?" Instead of answering directly, Lottie set down her sewing and moved to the shelf where Bram kept his small collection of books. She selected one, a volume of fairy tales he'd acquired years ago for reasons he couldn't remember, and brought it back to show him an illustration of women working at spinning, wheels and looms. You watched other women sewing, he interpreted. At the orphanage? A nod, but then she made a gesture that suggested before, something that had happened earlier in a different place, before the orphanage. When you lived with your parents. The confirmation was barely perceptible, just a slight movement of her head, but it spoke volumes about the life she'd led before tragedy reshaped her world. Bram felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he glimpsed the depth of loss carried by someone so young. As the snow deepened outside, their evening routine evolved into something almost comfortable. After supper, Lottie would settle on the bearskin rug with her sewing or a book, while Bram worked on his own projects, carving wooden bowls, repairing tools, or reading by the light of oil lamps. The silence between them grew less strained with each passing day, becoming companionable rather than cautious. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Bram made a decision that surprised even him. He'd been carving a replacement handle for a worn knife, the rhythmic scraping of blade against wood filling the comfortable quiet. When he looked up to find Lottie watching his work with fascination. "Want to learn?" he asked impulsively. Her eyes widened, but she nodded eagerly. "All right then. But we start with something less dangerous than a knife." He selected a piece of smooth pine from his woodpile and a smaller carving tool, one designed for detail work rather than heavy cutting. Settling beside Lottie on the rug, he showed her how to hold the wood steady and guide the blade with controlled pressure. "Always cut away from yourself," he instructed, positioning her small hands correctly. "The wood wants to tell you what it's meant to become. You just help it along." Lottie's first attempts were tentative, producing only the faintest scratches in the pine's surface. But Bram had infinite patience, having learned long ago that mountains taught you to think in terms of seasons rather than moments. He guided her hands when she struggled, showed her how to read the grain of the wood, and praised each small success with genuine enthusiasm. "There," he said, when she managed her first clean curl of shaving. "You're getting the feel of it." For the first time since he'd brought her home, Lottie made a sound, not quite a laugh, but a soft exhalation that might have been the ghost of one. The sound hit Bram like a physical blow, reminding him of Sarah's delighted giggles when he'd taught her to skip stones by the creek behind their old homestead. As November deepened into December, their shared activities expanded beyond necessity into something approaching companionship. Bram began teaching Lottie practical skills, how to tend the chickens without frightening them, how to read weather signs in the behavior of clouds and wind, how to maintain the cabin's oil lamps and keep them burning safely through the long nights. She proved to be a quick learner, absorbing information with the focused attention of someone who understood that knowledge meant survival. But more than that, she seemed genuinely interested in the work itself, approaching each new skill with careful curiosity rather than mere compliance. It was during one of these teaching sessions that Bram realized how much his own perspective had shifted. He found himself seeing his mountain sanctuary through Lottie's eyes, noting details he'd long taken for granted, explaining the reasoning behind routines that had become unconscious habits. Her presence was transforming his solitary refuge into something that felt, for the first time in decades, like a home where more than one person belonged, but even as their daily life found its rhythm. Bram couldn't escape the knowledge that the outside world hadn't forgotten about them. On his supply runs to Cedar Falls, he'd noticed the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms. The pointed questions from town officials about Lottie's welfare. The speculation that ranged from charitable to sinister, depending on who was doing the talking. Mrs. Pemberton, the boarding house owner, had been particularly vocal in her concerns. "It's not natural," she told anyone who would listen. "A man like that taking in a little girl. Mark my words, no good will come of it." Her husband, generally a more reasonable man, had tried to moderate her opinions. Maybe he's just doing a Christian thing, helping a child in need. Christian thing, my foot, Mrs. Pemberton had snorted. You don't see him in church on Sundays, do you? That man's got secrets, and I don't trust his motives. Bram had overheard enough of these conversations to know that suspicion was building in town. Some folks seemed genuinely concerned for Lottie's welfare, while others appeared more interested in the entertainment value of scandal. Either way, he understood that their peaceful isolation couldn't last indefinitely. Sooner or later, someone would decide to investigate his domestic arrangements more thoroughly. The realization brought back familiar feelings of helplessness that he'd thought buried with his old life. Once again, he was responsible for protecting someone precious, and once again, the world seemed determined to take her away. The difference was that this time, he might actually have the power to prevent it, if he could. Figure out how to navigate social expectations. He'd spent decades avoiding. These concerns weighed on his mind as December brought the first serious snowstorm of the season. For 3 days, wind howled around the cabin, while snow piled in drifts that reached the windows. Bram and Lottie were completely cut off from the outside world, dependent entirely on each other for company and the supplies they'd stockpiled for winter, far from feeling trapped. However, Bram found these isolated days surprisingly pleasant. With outside chores impossible, they spent their time reading, working on indoor projects, and simply talking, or rather, Bram talked, while Lottie listened with the kind of focused attention that made him feel heard in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He found himself sharing stories of his mountain life, encounters with bears and mountain lions, the year he'd been snowed in for 2 months and survived on stored food and melted snow, the time he'd nursed an injured eagle back to health, only to have it attack him when he tried to release it. These weren't tales of heroism, but of endurance, of learning to find peace in solitude and strength in self-reliance. Lottie absorbed these stories with visible fascination, occasionally asking questions through gestures when words failed her. Gradually, Bram began to understand her silent language, a tilt of her head that meant curiosity, a slight frown that indicated confusion, a particular way of clasping her hands that suggested she wanted to share something but couldn't find the words. It was during the storm's second night that their fragile routine faced its first real test. Bram woke to silence from the loft. Not the normal quiet of peaceful sleep, but the tense stillness of someone trying not to make noise while fighting internal demons. He'd learned to distinguish between Lottie's different types of silence, and this one concerned him. Climbing the ladder quietly, he found her sitting upright in her blankets, clutching her repaired doll and staring at nothing with the wide-eyed expression of someone caught between sleeping and waking. Her small body trembled with more than cold, and her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. "Another bad dream?" he asked softly. She turned toward his voice, but didn't seem to fully see him. Whatever images were playing behind her eyes had nothing to do with the safety of the mountain cabin. "You're safe here," Bram said, settling carefully at the top of the ladder. "Whatever you're seeing, it's not real anymore. You're in the mountains with me, and nothing can hurt you here." Slowly, her breathing began to steady. The wild look faded from her eyes as she focused on his face, using his presence to anchor herself in the present moment. "Want to tell me about it?" he asked. For a moment it seemed she might try. Her lips moved soundlessly, and her free hand made small, helpless gestures. But whatever she'd experienced was too large or too terrible for the limited communication they'd developed. Instead, she held up her doll, the same one he'd repaired weeks ago, and pointed to its carefully mended arm. Then she pointed to herself and made a similar gesture, as if indicating that she too had been broken and repaired. The connection took Bram's breath away. She was telling him that she understood what he'd done for her, not just fixing her toy, but taking her in when she was damaged and helping to make her whole again. The sophistication of the metaphor, coming from a child who rarely spoke aloud, revealed depths of understanding that humbled him. "Yes," he said quietly. "Sometimes things that are broken can be mended. And sometimes they're stronger afterward than they were before. She nodded solemnly, then surprised him by leaning against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that had become more common, but still felt like a gift each time it happened. They sat together in comfortable silence until her eyelids began to droop. As Bram helped her settle back under her blankets, he realized that somewhere in the process of caring for Lottie, he'd begun to heal wounds he'd thought permanently scarred. Her presence was teaching him that isolation, while safe, wasn't the same thing as peace. And peace, it turned out, was something worth risking safety to achieve. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, it revealed a world transformed by snow and wind. Drifts had reshaped the familiar landscape into something almost alien, with the cabin partially buried and the path to the barn completely obscured. But as Bram and Lottie worked together to dig their way out, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks, tucked under the eaves near the cabin's eastern wall. Where Mary's old garden lay dormant beneath the snow, a small collection of items had been carefully arranged and protected from the weather. Glass jars of various sizes, their contents mysterious. A wooden box that looked handmade. Several small cloth packets tied with string. "What's all this?" Bram asked, though he suspected he already knew. Lottie led him to the sheltered collection, her movements eager despite the knee-deep snow. She opened the wooden box first, revealing an assortment of seeds, some he recognized as herbs that had self-seeded in the abandoned garden. Others that looked like they might have come from vegetables served at their dinner table over the past weeks. The glass jars contained what appeared to be compost, kitchen scraps and organic matter that she'd been collecting and allowing to decompose. The cloth packets, when carefully unwrapped, revealed more seeds along with dried cuttings from plants that had somehow survived in the neglected garden space. "You've been planning," Bram said, understanding flooding through him. "All this time, you've been getting ready for spring." Lottie nodded enthusiastically, then pointed to the buried garden beds and made sweeping gestures that clearly indicated her vision for the space. Even through the snow, she seemed to see the potential for new growth, for life returning to ground that had lain fallow for too long. The revelation struck Bram with unexpected force. While he'd been focused on day-to-day survival and the immediate challenges of their situation, Lottie had been thinking months ahead, planning for a future that assumed she'd still be here when the snow melted. The quiet faith implicit in that assumption, her belief that this arrangement would last, that she'd found a permanent home, moved him more than any words could have. "Well then," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I suppose we'd better start thinking about proper garden tools, and maybe some books about growing things in mountain soil." The smile that lit up Lottie's face was worth every moment of uncertainty he'd felt about taking her in. For the first time since that day on the auction block, she looked like what she was. A 6-year-old girl excited about something she loved. As they made their way through the snow to check on the animals, Bram found himself seeing the mountain sanctuary through new eyes. Where he'd built a fortress against the world, Lottie saw a canvas for creation. Where he'd focused on preservation and endurance, she dreamed of growth and beauty. Her perspective was changing his relationship with the place he'd called home for over 20 years. The next few weeks brought a routine that felt increasingly natural despite its novelty. Mornings began with tending the animals together, Lottie proving herself fearless around the chickens and surprisingly gentle with Sage and the pack mule. Afternoons were devoted to indoor projects, sewing, carving, reading, and the careful planning of spring gardens. It was during one of these planning sessions that Lottie made another breakthrough in communication. They were sitting at the kitchen table with paper and pencils, sketching potential layouts for the expanded garden, when she suddenly grabbed Bram's wrist and pointed to his hand holding the pencil. "What is it?" he asked. She mimed writing, then pointed to herself and shook her head. It took him a moment to understand. "You can't write?" She nodded, then held up her fingers, first 5, then one more to indicate her age. "Well, 6 is plenty old enough to learn. Why didn't you say something before?" Lottie made a gesture that encompassed their entire situation, as if to say that writing had seemed less important than everything else they'd been navigating. "Reading and writing go together," Bram said firmly. "If you're going to be planning gardens and keeping track of what grows where, you'll need to be able to make notes. Besides—" He paused, struck by a memory of his own daughter laboriously copying letters on a slate board. "Besides, every person deserves to be able to write their own name." What followed was perhaps the most rewarding teaching experience of Bram's life. Lottie approached learning to write with the same focused intensity she brought to everything else, practicing letters with determined concentration until her small hand cramped from the effort. She traced letters in flour spread on the kitchen table, copied words from books, and gradually began forming simple sentences that expressed her thoughts and observations. Her first written words were, "Thank you for the doll." Her first sentence was, "The garden will be beautiful in spring." Her first paragraph, laboriously crafted over several days, was a description of how she imagined the vegetables and flowers growing together in harmony, each plant supporting the others in ways that seemed to reflect her understanding of how relationships should work. As Lottie's confidence in writing grew, so did her willingness to express herself in other ways. She began humming while she worked, wordless melodies that filled the cabin with something it had never contained before, the sound of contentment. She started initiating activities rather than simply following Bram's lead, bringing him books she wanted to share or showing him small discoveries she'd made around the cabin. Most remarkably, she began to laugh. It started as small sounds, exhaled breath that carried the hint of amusement when Bram told stories about his more embarrassing encounters with wildlife. But gradually, those ghost laughs developed into something approaching genuine mirth. The first time she produced an actual giggle in response to watching him try to extract an egg from beneath a particularly stubborn hen, Bram had to step outside the coop to collect himself. The sound of a child's laughter in his home had been absent for so long that hearing it again felt like recovering a sense he'd forgotten he possessed. It brought back memories of Sarah's bright peals of delight, but instead of the familiar stab of loss, he felt something warmer, gratitude for the chance to experience that joy again. But even as their domestic life found its rhythm, the outside world continued to intrude in subtle ways. During his monthly supply runs to Cedar Falls, Bram noticed changes in how people treated him. The wary respect he'd earned through years of competent self-reliance was being replaced by something more complicated, a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and barely concealed speculation about his motives. The town doctor, a reasonable man named Peterson, had approached him directly during his January trip. "Heard you've taken in the orphan girl," Peterson had said without preamble. "News travels fast," Bram had replied carefully. "In a town this size, everything travels fast. Folks are wondering about her welfare. Child hasn't been seen since the auction. Some are concerned. She's well cared for. I'm sure she is. But you understand people's concerns. A man living alone, suddenly responsible for a young girl. It raises questions." Bram had studied the doctor's face, trying to determine whether this was genuine concern or something more pointed. What kind of questions? The kind that might lead to official inquiries if they're not addressed. "I'm not saying I agree with the gossip, but I am saying it exists. Might be wise to have the girl examined by a physician, just to quiet the talk." The suggestion had been delivered diplomatically, but Bram understood the underlying threat. Bring Lottie to town for medical evaluation, or face the possibility of more serious intervention from territorial authorities. That conversation had occupied his thoughts during the long ride back to the cabin. How could he explain to officials that Lottie was thriving in ways that went far beyond physical health? How could he make them understand that her silence wasn't a sign of abuse, but of healing that needed time and safety to complete? When he shared his concerns with Lottie, carefully in terms she could understand, her response surprised him. She listened thoughtfully to his explanation of the town's concerns, then went to the shelf and selected the journal where she'd been practicing her writing. After several minutes of careful composition, she showed him what she'd written. "I'm safe here. I'm happy here. This is my home now." The simple declaration, written in her careful child's script, carried more weight than any official document. But Bram knew that the outside world would require more than Lottie's word to accept their unconventional arrangement. The question was whether they could navigate those expectations without destroying the fragile trust they'd built together. As February brought its own storms and long nights, Bram found himself planning not just for spring gardens, but for a future that included protecting the sanctuary they'd created together. Whatever challenges the outside world might bring, he was determined not to lose this second chance at family, even if it meant fighting a battle he'd spent 20 years trying to avoid. The knock on the cabin door came on a Tuesday morning in late February, sharp and authoritative in the mountain silence. Bram had been teaching Lottie to identify different types of wood by their grain patterns, a skill that would help her choose the right materials for garden stakes and plant supports. The sound of knuckles against oak froze them both in place. No one climbed the mountain trail to Bram's cabin, uninvited. The path was difficult even in good weather, dangerous in winter, and known to discourage casual visitors. Anyone who made the journey had serious business in mind. "Stay here," Bram murmured to Lottie, who had already positioned herself where she could see both him and the back door. Her survival instincts, honed by years of uncertain circumstances, had kicked in automatically. Bram opened the heavy oak door to find Reverend Morrison standing on his threshold, snow clinging to his black coat and breath steaming in the thin mountain air. The preacher was a lean man with intelligent eyes and a reputation for reasoned thinking, though his presence at Bram's door suggested something more than a social call. "Reverend," Bram said carefully, "long way to come for a visit. May I come in?" Morrison asked. "We have things to discuss." Bram stepped aside, noting how the preacher's gaze immediately found Lottie standing near the fireplace. She'd wrapped herself in a shawl and held her repaired doll close, presenting the picture of a well-cared-for child despite the wariness in her dark eyes. "Coffee," Bram offered, falling back on the basic courtesy that mountain hospitality demanded. "Please." Morrison settled himself at the kitchen table, accepting the steaming cup with hands that were red from cold, despite his gloves. "Miss Lottie, isn't it?" "You're looking well." Lottie nodded politely but didn't approach. Instead, she moved to the bookshelf and selected a volume, settling into the rocking chair with the careful dignity of someone determined to appear occupied and uninteresting. "She's grown," Morrison observed to Bram. "Looks healthy, well-fed." Mountain air agrees with her. Bram took the chair across from the preacher, positioning himself where he could see both Morrison and Lottie. "Though I doubt you climbed up here in February to comment on her health." Morrison sipped his coffee, thoughtfully. "You're right. I came because the town is talking, Bram. And when a town like Cedar Falls starts talking about a man and a little girl, those conversations tend to reach official ears." "What kind of official ears?" "The territorial governor has appointed a child welfare officer for this region. A fellow named Clarence Whitmore used to be a schoolmaster back east before he got into government work. He's been asking questions about arrangements like yours." Bram felt his chest tighten. "Arrangements like mine? Single men caring for unrelated children? The territorial government has concerns about proper supervision, moral influence, educational opportunities. They're developing policies about such placements." "Lottie's not a placement. She's—" Bram stopped, realizing he wasn't entirely sure how to finish that sentence. "What was she, legally speaking?" He'd purchased her services at an auction, but that hardly constituted a legal guardianship. "That's part of the problem," Morrison said gently. "Your relationship with the child has no official recognition. In the eyes of the law, you're simply a man who paid money for a girl at auction. That raises certain questions about your intentions." From her chair by the fireplace, Lottie looked up from her book. Though she appeared to be reading, Bram could tell she was listening to every word. "My intentions are to keep her safe and cared for," Bram said firmly. "I believe that, Having seen her today, I think most reasonable people would believe that. But reasonable people aren't always the ones making decisions about children's welfare. Morrison reached into his coat and withdrew a worn leather Bible, placing it on the table between them. That's why I'm here. The town council has asked me to make you an offer. What kind of offer? Legal guardianship. Properly documented, filed with the territorial authorities. It would give you official standing as Lottie's guardian, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Bram studied the preacher's face. And in exchange, you attend church services regularly. Bring Lottie with you. Show the community that she's receiving proper moral instruction along with material care. The proposal hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Bram understood the politics involved. His presence in church would demonstrate community acceptance of their arrangement, while Lottie's appearance would prove she was healthy and well cared for. It was a reasonable solution to an unreasonable problem. I haven't set foot in a church in 23 years, Bram said quietly. I know. People remember when you first came to the mountains. You were a different man then, angry, closed off, wanting nothing to do with God or community. But you're different now. Morrison glanced toward Lottie. She's changed you. How would you know that? Because you let her stay. The man who came here 23 years ago would have brought that child back to town the next morning and washed his hands of the whole business. But you didn't. You saw something in her that needed protecting, and you opened your home to provide it. Morrison leaned forward slightly. That's the action of a man whose heart isn't as closed as he pretends. And if your heart isn't closed, then your soul isn't beyond redemption. Bram felt the familiar resistance rising in his chest, the automatic rejection of anything that smacked of divine providence or spiritual purpose. He'd stopped believing in God's plan the day he found Mary's body in the ruins of their cabin. But he couldn't deny that something had prompted him to bid on Lottie at that auction, something beyond practical consideration or rational thought. What if I refuse? He asked. Then you take your chances with territorial authorities who don't know you, don't understand your situation, and have the power to remove Lottie from your care, based on nothing more than bureaucratic policy. The threat was delivered gently, but it was a threat nonetheless. Bram looked at Lottie, who had set aside her book and was watching their conversation with the intense attention of someone whose fate was being decided by others. Again. I need time to think, Bram said. Of course, but don't take too long. Whitmore is expected in Cedar Falls sometime next month. It would be better if your situation was already regularized before he arrives. Morrison rose to leave, then paused. Bram, I know you have reasons for staying away from the church, reasons for staying away from God. But consider this, maybe God didn't abandon you 23 years ago. Maybe you abandoned him, and he's been waiting for you to find your way back. After the preacher left, Bram sat in his chair staring at the Bible that had been left on his table. Outside, wind whistled through the pines with the lonely sound that had been his constant companion for over 2 decades. But inside the cabin, silence had a different quality now. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but of companionship temporarily suspended. You heard all that, he said to Lottie. She nodded, then approached the table and picked up the Bible. She opened it carefully, as if handling something fragile and valuable, and turned through several pages before stopping at a passage that seemed to interest her. Can you read that? Bram asked. Lottie pointed to individual words, sounding them out silently, then looked up at him with a question in her eyes. What is it? She brought the book closer and pointed to a specific verse. Bram read it aloud. He sets the solitary in families. The words hit him like a physical blow. Of all the verses in the Bible, she'd somehow found the one that spoke directly to their situation. Whether by accident or design, her selection seemed to offer commentary on their circumstances that was either profoundly meaningful or simply coincidental. Do you know what that means? He asked. Lottie nodded, then pointed to herself and then to him, making a gesture that encompassed the cabin and everything it represented. She understood that they were both solitary people who had somehow formed something resembling a family. That evening, as they sat by the fire reading in comfortable quiet, Bram found himself considering Morrison's offer with new perspective. The idea of returning to church still made his chest tight with old anger and pain, but the idea of losing Lottie made it impossible to breathe at all. He'd spent 23 years running from anything that resembled community or faith, convinced that isolation was the only protection against loss. But Lottie's presence had already breached those defenses. The question now was whether he was willing to breach them further in order to protect what they'd built together. As if sensing his thoughts, Lottie looked up from her book and smiled at him, one of those genuine expressions of contentment that still had the power to stop his heart. In that moment, Bram realized that his choice had already been made. He would do whatever was necessary to keep her safe, even if it meant facing the God he'd been running from for over 2 decades. The Bible remained on the kitchen table that night, a silent reminder of both the offer that had been made and the decision that lay ahead. And for the first time in 23 years, Bram found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, his long exile was finally coming to an end. The decision to attend church services proved easier to make than to execute. For a man who'd spent over 2 decades avoiding human contact beyond the bare necessities, the prospect of sitting among the townspeople of Cedar Falls while they studied him, and Lottie felt like stepping into a den of wolves. But as March brought the first hints of spring to the high country, Bram knew he could no longer postpone the inevitable. The challenge began with appropriate clothing. Neither he nor Lottie owned anything resembling Sunday attire. Bram's wardrobe consisted entirely of practical mountain gear, leather, wool, and sturdy cotton designed for durability rather than appearance. Lottie's carefully sewn dresses were warm and well-made, but hardly suited for formal occasions. "We'll need to make another trip to town," Bram said one morning as he surveyed their limited options. "Get proper church clothes." Lottie looked up from the wooden horse she'd been examining, a toy Bram had been carving in secret during the long winter evenings. The project had started as a way to occupy his hands while she practiced her writing, but had evolved into something more elaborate than he'd originally intended. The horse was life-sized for a child's toy, with careful attention to anatomical detail and a mane that flowed like it was caught in wind. She'd discovered it that morning while exploring the workshop, her eyes widening with delight when she realized it was meant for her. Now she carried it everywhere, treating it with the same reverence she showed her repaired doll, but with an added joy that spoke to the difference between salvaging something broken and receiving something made specifically for her. "You like the horse?" Bram asked, deflecting from his anxiety about the upcoming social challenges. Lottie nodded enthusiastically, then surprised him by setting the toy down and approaching his workbench. She pointed to the carving tools, then to herself, making the gesture that had come to mean, "May I try?" "You want to learn wood carving?" Another nod, this one accompanied by the kind of focused attention she brought to activities that genuinely interested her. Bram selected a small piece of pine and a detail knife, settling beside her on the workshop bench. "All right then, but we start simple, maybe a small bird or a flower." What followed was one of the most peaceful afternoons they'd shared since her arrival. Lottie approached wood carving with the same methodical care she brought to everything else, listening carefully to his instructions and practicing each technique until her small hands could execute it reliably. Her first attempts produced only wood shavings and frustration, but gradually she began to find the rhythm that allowed the knife to follow her intentions rather than fighting against them. By evening, she'd managed to carve a recognizable flower, simple but undeniably deliberate in its design. The accomplishment filled her with visible pride, and she placed the wooden flower on the kitchen table like a centerpiece. "That's fine work," Bram said, and meant it. "You've got steady hands and patience. Those are the most important things for carving." Lottie beamed at the praise, then went to the shelf and returned with her writing journal. After a few minutes of careful composition, She showed him her latest entry. Bram is teaching me to make beautiful things. I want to make him something special. The words hit him harder than they should have. In his previous life, before tragedy had reshaped his world, he'd taken pleasure in creating beauty, carving decorative elements for the cabin he'd shared with Mary, crafting toys for Sarah, building furniture, carving decorative elements for the cabin he'd shared with Mary, crafting toys for Sarah, building furniture that was both functional and pleasing to look at. But after losing them, he'd focused solely on utility, creating only what was necessary for survival. Lottie's presence was awakening parts of himself he'd thought permanently dormant. Through her eyes, he was rediscovering the joy of making something beautiful, simply because beauty had value in itself. The trip to Cedar Falls for church clothes proved to be an ordeal that tested both their patience and their resolve. The town's seamstress, Mrs. Henley, took Lottie's measurements with the kind of thorough attention that felt more like an inspection than a fitting. Her questions were pointed and persistent. "She's grown since October," the woman observed. "Filled out some too. Been eating regular, I'd say. Mountain air and good food," Bram replied neutrally. And she's been learning her letters. Child needs proper schooling, you know. Can't get that up on the mountain all by herself. She's learning." Mrs. Henley's hands worked with professional efficiency, but her eyes missed nothing as she examined Lottie's general health and demeanor. "Still not talking much, is she? Seems subdued." Bram felt Lottie tense beside him. The woman's probing questions were making her uncomfortable, bringing back the kind of scrutiny she'd endured at the orphanage and during the auction. "She speaks when she has something to say," Bram said firmly. "Some people are naturally quiet." Mrs. Henley made notes on her pad with unnecessary flourish. "Well, I can have a dress ready by Sunday. Simple blue cotton with white collar and cuffs. Appropriate for church. For himself." Bram purchased a ready-made suit from the dry goods store. Black wool that fit well enough and would serve the purpose of making him look respectable in the eyes of the congregation. The expense was significant, but less than the cost of losing Lottie to territorial authorities. As they prepared to leave town, they were intercepted by Dr. Peterson, who'd apparently been watching for their departure. "Mr. McCready," the doctor called. "Might I have a word?" They spoke beside Bram's horse while Lottie waited nearby, close enough to hear, but far enough to avoid feeling trapped. "The child looks well," Peterson observed. "Better than when she was at the auction, actually. You've been feeding her properly. I take care of what's mine. That's what I told Whitmore when he asked about your situation." Bram felt his blood chill. "Whitmore's been here. Passed through last week. Asked a lot of questions about unusual domestic arrangements in the territory. Your name came up. What did you tell him?" "The truth. That I'd observed the child to be healthy and well cared for, based on what I'd seen in town. But he's planning a more thorough investigation when he returns next month." "What kind of investigation?" "Home visit, interview with the child, medical examination if he deems it necessary." Peterson's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I'm not trying to alarm you, but you should be prepared. Whitmore's got strong opinions about proper child rearing, and he's not particularly impressed by unconventional arrangements." The ride back to the cabin passed in tense silence. Bram's mind raced through possibilities, contingencies, ways to protect Lottie from bureaucratic interference that could tear apart the fragile stability they'd built. Beside him, Lottie sat with her wooden horse clutched against her chest, sensing his anxiety even if she didn't fully understand its source. That evening, as they worked together preparing supper, Lottie surprised him by approaching with her writing journal. "I heard what the doctor said," she'd written. "Will they take me away?" The directness of the question caught Bram off guard. He'd been trying to shield her from his concerns, but her perceptiveness had cut through his attempts at protection. "Not if I can help it," he said finally. "But we need to be ready for questions." "Official questions from people who don't know us." Lottie nodded thoughtfully, then wrote another line. "What do I tell them?" "The truth, that you're safe here, that you're learning and growing, that this is your home." Bram paused. "Are those things true?" Her response was immediate and emphatic. Yes, then that's what we tell them. But even as he spoke the words, Bram knew that truth and official acceptability weren't always the same thing. The bond he and Lottie had formed defied easy categorization. It wasn't quite father and daughter, wasn't adoption in any legal sense, wasn't even a traditional guardian arrangement. It was something more organic and harder to define. Two damaged people who'd found healing in each other's company. Whether territorial authorities would recognize the validity of such a relationship remained to be seen. But as Bram watched Lottie carefully arrange her wooden horse and repaired doll on the shelf beside her bed that night, he knew he would fight any force that tried to separate them. She'd become part of his life in ways that went deeper than legal documents or social conventions. The wooden horse sat on the shelf like a symbol of their bond, something beautiful, created from raw materials through patience, skill, and care. It represented what they'd built together, a relationship that was stronger and more meaningful than either of them had expected when a frightened child and a lonely man first encountered each other on an auction block in Cedar Falls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they navigated the complex social requirements of church attendance and community acceptance. But tonight, in the warm sanctuary of the mountain cabin, they were simply a family, unconventional perhaps, but real in all the ways that mattered. Clarence Whitmore arrived in Cedar Falls on a Tuesday morning in early April, 3 days ahead of schedule, and without the courtesy of advance warning. His unannounced appearance caught the town off guard and set in motion a series of events that would forever change how people viewed both Bram McCready and the child he'd taken in. Whitmore was a thin, sharp-featured man with the kind of meticulous grooming that spoke of someone who believed appearance reflected character. His questions were pointed, and his manner suggested he'd already formed opinions about the situations he'd come to investigate. Within hours of his arrival, word spread through Cedar Falls that the territorial child welfare officer was conducting interviews about irregular domestic arrangements. Dr. Peterson was among the first to be questioned, followed by Mrs. Henley, the schoolmaster, and several prominent townspeople. But it was Whitmore's conversation with Jake Morrison, the farmer who'd been outbid at Lottie's auction, that provided the ammunition. The official seemed to be seeking. Man like that don't bid $20 on a child out of Christian charity. Morrison told anyone who would listen after his interview, Whitmore's got the right idea asking hard questions. Something ain't natural about that arrangement. Word of Whitmore's investigation reached Bram through Reverend Morrison, who climbed the mountain trail that evening with news that made the blood drain from Bram's face. He's planning to visit your cabin tomorrow, the preacher said without preamble. Unannounced, so he can observe your natural domestic situation. His words, not mine. Bram stood in his doorway, blocking Whitmore's view of the cabin's interior, where Lottie was practicing her writing at the kitchen table. What kind of observation? Full inspection, interview with the child, examination of living conditions, assessment of her physical and emotional state. He's got the authority to remove her immediately if he finds anything he considers inappropriate. Based on what criteria? His judgment, which from what I have observed today tends toward the suspicious. Morrison's expression was grim. Bram, I need to tell you something else. Whitmore's been asking specific questions about your background. He knows you weren't born Bram McCready. The words hit like a physical blow. For 23 years, Bram had lived under his assumed name, had built his mountain sanctuary on the foundation of a carefully constructed new identity. Only a handful of people had ever known the truth about his past, and he'd believed that knowledge died with them. How much does he know? Enough to be asking about military service records and deceased family members. He's got resources, Bram. Official channels for investigating people's histories. From inside the cabin came the sound of Lottie's chair scraping against the floor. A moment later, she appeared beside Bram in the doorway, her small hand slipping into his with the instinctive trust that had developed between them over the long winter months. "What's wrong?" she asked, speaking aloud for the first time in Reverend Morrison's presence. The sound of her voice clearly surprised the preacher, but Bram was too focused on the crisis at hand to register the breakthrough. "We might have visitors tomorrow," Bram said carefully. "Official visitors with questions." Lottie's grip on his hand tightened. "The man the doctor told us about?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the serious consideration she brought to all matters of importance. "Then what do we do?" The simple question crystallized Bram's thinking. For months, he'd been reactive, responding to external pressures and social expectations while trying to protect the sanctuary they'd built together. But Lottie's direct question demanded a more proactive approach. "We tell the truth," he said finally. "All of it. About who I was, who I am now, and why you belong here." That night, after Reverend Morrison had departed with promises to pray for them both, Bram sat Lottie down at the kitchen table and shared the story he'd never told anyone since arriving in the mountains. "My real name is Abraham Thorne," he began. "I was a soldier for 12 years before I became a settler. I served in the Indian Wars, fought in campaigns from Texas to Montana Territory." Lottie listened with the focused attention she brought to all important conversations, asking no questions but absorbing every detail. "I was good at soldiering," Bram continued. "Too good, maybe. I knew how to track enemies, how to plan attacks, how to keep my men alive in situations where survival seemed impossible. But being good at war doesn't make you good at peace." He told her about Mary, about Sarah, about the Comanche raid that had destroyed his first family while he was away chasing stolen cattle. He explained how guilt and grief had driven him to the mountains, how he'd changed his name and tried to bury his past along with his loved ones. "But you can't really bury the past," he said. "It follows you wherever you go, shapes who you become whether you want it to or not. Is that why you helped me?" Lottie asked quietly. "Because of your daughter?" "Partly. But mostly because when I saw you standing on that auction block, I recognized something in your eyes. The same look I'd seen in my own mirror for too many years. Someone who'd lost everything but was still fighting to survive." Lottie was quiet for a long time, digesting this revelation. Finally she asked, "What was your daughter like?" "Smart, curious about everything. She loved making things grow, had a garden of her own where she experimented with different plants." Bram smiled at the memory. "She would have liked you, I think, and she would have loved your plans for the garden. I wish I could have met her. In a way, you did. Some of what I've taught you, about plants, about taking care of things, about finding beauty in simple work, those were things she taught me first." The next morning brought Clarence Whitmore and 2 territorial deputies up the mountain trail. Bram watched their approach from the cabin's front window, noting the official bearing and serious expressions that suggested this was more than a routine inspection. "Remember," he told Lottie as they prepared to face their visitors, "just tell the truth about how you feel here, about what your days are like, about whether you feel safe." "I will," she promised. The knock on the door came precisely at 10 o'clock. Bram opened it to find Whitmore flanked by his deputies, all 3 men dressed in formal territorial uniforms that looked absurdly out of place against the mountain backdrop. Mr. McCready, or should I say, Sergeant Abraham Thorne, late of the 4th Cavalry Regiment. The use of his real name and military rank hit Bram like a slap. But instead of the expected surge of panic, he felt something closer to relief. The hiding was over. "Abraham Thorne died with his family 23 years ago," Bram said evenly. "I'm Bram McCready now. Are you?" Whitmore's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Because my research suggests that Sergeant Thorne was quite the war hero. Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, decorated for saving an entire settlement from Comanche raiders. Pity he couldn't save his own family." The cruel observation hung in the air like smoke from a poisonous fire. Behind Bram, Lottie stepped forward, her small frame radiating an anger that surprised everyone present. "Don't talk to him like that," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He's a good man. He saved me." Whitmore's attention shifted to her with calculating interest. "And you must be Charlotte. I understand you've been living here in quite irregular circumstances. My name is Lottie, and this is my home." "Is it?" According to territorial records, you're an orphaned ward of the state, placed temporarily in the care of a man with no legal standing as your guardian. A man, I might add, who's been living under an assumed identity for over 2 decades. Bram felt the situation slipping away from him. But before he could respond, Lottie stepped fully into the doorway. "He didn't just take care of me," she said with quiet dignity. "He saved me from people who would have hurt me, from places that were cold and scary, from feeling like nobody in the world cared if I lived or died. Child, you don't understand the complexities. I understand that before I came here, I couldn't remember the last time an adult had been kind to me. I understand that Bram taught me to read and write, taught me to make beautiful things, taught me that I was worth protecting." Lottie's voice grew stronger with each word. "And I understand that if you take me away from here, you'll be doing exactly what those Comanche raiders did to his first family, destroying something good because you can." The comparison stunned everyone into silence. Even Whitmore seemed taken aback by the child's articulate defense and her knowledge of Bram's history. It was then that Reverend Morrison appeared on the trail, leading a group of townspeople who had climbed the mountain to witness whatever was happening at Bram's cabin. Dr. Peterson was among them, along with Mrs. Henley, the schoolmaster, and several families who had attended the church services where Bram and Lottie had become regular fixtures over the past month. "Gentlemen," Reverend Morrison called as he approached, "I hope we're not too late to provide some context for your investigation." Whitmore's expression soured. "This is an official territorial inquiry, Reverend. Civilian interference is not welcome. Then perhaps you'd like to see these civilian documents before you proceed," Dr. Peterson said, stepping forward with a leather portfolio. "Official statements from every adult who's had contact with Mr. McCready and Miss Lottie over the past 6 months." "What kind of statements?" "Testimony to the child's health, her educational progress, her general demeanor and happiness. Testimony to the quality of care she's receiving and the evident bond between guardian and child." Mrs. Henley, of all people, stepped forward next. "I owe that man an apology," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And this child too. I've been suspicious and judgmental when I should have been grateful that someone was willing to take in a little girl who needed a home. The circumstances are highly irregular." Whitmore began. "So was leaving her on an auction block like livestock," the schoolmaster interrupted. "At least Mr. McCready saw a child who needed protecting and did something about it, one by one." The townspeople shared their observations of Bram and Lottie's relationship, small moments witnessed in church, interactions seen during supply trips to town, evidence of a bond that had grown from necessity into something resembling genuine family affection. But it was the document that Dr. Peterson handed to Whitmore that finally shifted the balance of the confrontation. "What is this?" the official asked, scanning the formal territorial letterhead. "Military service record for Sergeant Abraham Thorne. Seems your research was incomplete, Mr. Whitmore. Sergeant Thorne didn't just receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. He received it for single-handedly defending a settlement of 30 families against a war party of over 100 Comanche raiders. He held them off for 2 days until reinforcements arrived, saving every life in that settlement." Whitmore's face had gone pale as he read the details of Bram's military service. "Furthermore," Dr. Peterson continued, "the record shows that Sergeant Thorne's own family was killed in a separate raid while he was away on official duty he'd volunteered for because he believed his military skills could help protect other settlements. He lost his wife and daughter while trying to save other people's wives and daughters. The revelation hung in the mountain air like morning mist. Even the deputies looked uncomfortable as they began to understand that they were facing not a potential criminal, but a war hero whose only crime had been surviving when his loved ones didn't. Lottie, who had been listening to this recounting of Bram's past with wide eyes, suddenly stepped forward and took his scarred hand in both of her small ones. "Is that why you saved me?" she asked quietly. "Because you couldn't save them?" Bram looked down at her upturned face, seeing in her dark eyes the same fierce loyalty that had prompted her to defend him moments earlier. "No," he said honestly. "I saved you because you needed saving. And because—" He paused, struggling with words that had never come easily. "Because taking care of you has taught me that maybe I'm not as broken as I thought I was." The admission seemed to settle something in the air around them. Even Whitmore appeared to be reconsidering his assumptions as he looked from the military service record to the child who stood protectively beside her chosen guardian. "This doesn't change the irregular nature of the arrangement," he said finally. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Then let's make it regular," Reverend Morrison said firmly. "Legal guardianship, properly filed and documented. I'll personally vouch for both Mr. McCready's character and Miss Lottie's welfare." "As will I," Dr. Peterson added. "And I," said Mrs. Henley, one by one. The assembled townspeople added their voices to the chorus of support. What had begun as an investigation into suspected impropriety had transformed into a community's recognition of something precious and worth protecting. Whitmore looked around at the faces surrounding him, townspeople who had climbed a difficult mountain trail to defend a man and child they barely knew 6 months ago, but who had somehow become part of their community's fabric. "I'll need to file a complete report with the territorial governor," he said finally. "Of course," Reverend Morrison agreed. "But I trust that report will reflect the reality of what you've observed here today." As the official party prepared to leave, Whitmore paused beside Bram and Lottie. "You're fortunate to have such community support," he said quietly. "Not all irregular arrangements end so favorably." "I know," Bram replied. "And I won't forget the kindness people have shown us today." After the officials and townspeople had departed, Bram and Lottie sat together on the cabin's front porch, watching the last of the group disappear down the mountain trail. "So what happens now?" Lottie asked. "Now we file the paperwork to make this official. Legal guardianship, like Reverend Morrison suggested. And then we plant that garden you've been planning all winter. And we keep building the life we started here." Lottie leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that had become natural over the months they'd spent together. "Bram." "Yes? I'm glad you told me about your real name. About Sarah and your wife. Why?" "Because now I understand why you're so good at taking care of people. You learned from losing them how precious it is when someone chooses to stay." The observation, delivered with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed, hit Bram with unexpected force. She was right. Loss had taught him the value of presence. Grief had shown him the importance of protection. And love, even love that ended in tragedy, had prepared him to recognize it when it appeared again in an unexpected form. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Bram realized that his long exile was finally over, not because he'd returned to the world, but because the world had found its way to him in the form of a silent child who had taught him that some things were worth the risk of loving again. The legal guardianship papers arrived by territorial mail 3 weeks after Whitmore's visit, bearing official seals and formal language that transformed Bram and Lottie's relationship from an arrangement of convenience into something recognized by law. But even as Bram signed the documents that made him Lottie's legal guardian, he couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The transformation of their status had unexpected consequences. Throughout Cedar Falls, where once Bram had been viewed with suspicious wariness, he now found himself regarded as something approaching a local hero. The revelation of his military service and the circumstances surrounding his assumed identity had shifted public opinion dramatically. But the attention made him deeply uncomfortable. "People keep staring," Lottie observed during their weekly trip to town for supplies. They'd just left the general store, where their simple transaction had been interrupted 3 times by townspeople wanting to shake Bram's hand or comment on how well Lottie looked. "They're not used to thinking of me as anything other than the hermit in the mountains," Bram replied. "Give them time to adjust." But it wasn't just curiosity that followed them through Cedar Falls. There was something else in the way people looked at them now, a recognition that their bond represented something precious and rare, something worth protecting. It was gratifying and terrifying in equal measure. The spring thaw had come early that year, melting the mountain snow and revealing the garden space that had occupied Lottie's thoughts throughout the long winter. She'd spent countless hours planning the layout, sketching designs in her journal, and cataloguing the seeds she'd collected and preserved. Now, with the soil finally workable, she threw herself into the actual planting with an enthusiasm that transformed the entire atmosphere. Around the cabin, this section will be for vegetables, she explained to Bram as they worked, together preparing the beds. Carrots, beans, squash, things we can eat and preserve for winter. But here, she gestured to an area near the cabin's eastern wall. This will be for flowers, just because they're beautiful. Watching her work, Bram was struck by how much she'd grown in the months since her arrival. The silent, frightened child from the auction block had evolved into someone confident enough to direct a grown man's efforts in service of her vision. She moved through the garden space with authority, pointing out where each plant should go based on sun exposure, soil drainage, and aesthetic considerations that revealed a sophisticated understanding of design. "Where did you learn about gardening?" he asked, as they planted the first rows of seeds. "My mother had a garden," Lottie said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone she used when referring to her life before the orphanage. "I helped her plant things every spring." She said gardens were proof that beautiful things could grow anywhere if you gave them enough love and attention. It was one of the longest speeches she'd made about her parents, and Bram sensed the significance of her willingness to share such memories. Over the winter months, she'd gradually opened up about her past, but always in small pieces, as if testing whether it was safe to let those particular ghosts into the light. "She sounds like a wise woman," Bram said. She was. "She taught me that every living thing has something to offer, even if it doesn't look like much at first." Lottie paused in her planting to look directly at him. "I think she would have liked you." The simple statement carried more weight than volumes of formal appreciation. Coming from a child who rarely spoke of her lost parents, it represented acceptance at the deepest level. As May brought warmer weather and longer days, their garden began to show the first green shoots of new growth. Lottie checked on the emerging plants daily, watering them carefully and protecting the most delicate seedlings from late spring frosts. Her dedication was absolute, and her joy in each new development was infectious, but their peaceful routine was disrupted by an unexpected visitor. Judge Harrison Wells, the territorial magistrate who had approved their guardianship arrangement, appeared at their cabin door on a warm Saturday morning in late May. "Your Honor," Bram said, surprised by the visit. "This is unexpected. May I come in? I have matters to discuss that require privacy." Judge Wells was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of measured bearing that came from decades of making difficult decisions. His presence at the cabin suggested something more serious than a social call. "Coffee," Bram offered as they settled at the kitchen table. "Please." Wells accepted the cup gratefully, then got straight to business. "I'm here because there's been a development in your case that requires immediate attention." Lottie, who had been tending her garden when the judge arrived, appeared in the doorway with soil still clinging to her hands and a worried expression on her face. "What kind of development?" Bram asked. "A relative has come forward claiming legal rights to Miss Lottie, a woman named Margaret Carver, who says she's the child's maternal aunt." The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Lottie went perfectly still, her face draining of color as she processed this information. "That's impossible," Bram said finally. The orphanage records showed no living relatives. Apparently, Mrs. Carver was traveling abroad when Lottie's parents died. She only recently returned to the United States and learned of their deaths. She's been searching for the child ever since. Wells pulled a document from his satchel and placed it on the table. "She's filed a formal petition for custody, claiming prior legal rights as blood family." The territorial governor is taking her claims seriously. Bram scanned the legal papers, his heart sinking as he read the formal language that threatened to tear apart everything they'd built together. What does this mean? It means there will be a hearing. Mrs. Carver will present her case for custody, and you'll have the opportunity to present yours. The court will decide what arrangement is in Lottie's best interests. When? 2 weeks from today. In the territorial courthouse in Helena, the timeline felt impossibly short. 2 weeks to prepare for a legal battle that could result in losing Lottie forever, the child who had become the center of his world, who had taught him that his heart wasn't as permanently broken as he'd believed. What are our chances? Bram asked quietly. Judge Wells's expression was sympathetic but realistic. Blood family has strong legal standing in custody matters. Mrs. Carver is a widow with financial means and social standing in Denver society. She can offer Lottie educational opportunities, cultural advantages, a life among her own social class. And what can I offer? Love, stability, a home where she's already thriving. Wells paused. But you have to understand, the law tends to favor conventional arrangements. A single woman with family connections will likely be viewed more favorably than a single man with no blood relation to the child. From the doorway, Lottie finally spoke. Does anyone care what I want? Both men turned to look at her. She'd been so quiet during the conversation that they'd almost forgotten she was listening to every word that would determine her fate. Of course we care, Judge Wells said gently. Your preferences will be considered, though the final decision rests with the court. Then why does it feel like you're all talking about me like I'm not here? Like I'm just a thing to be given to whoever has the best legal claim? The accusation stung because it contained more truth than either man wanted to acknowledge. In their focus on legal procedures and social expectations, they'd been discussing Lottie's future without fully including her voice in the conversation. You're right, Bram said, turning to face her directly. This is about your life, your home, your future. What do you want? I want to stay here with you. This is my home now, even if this aunt could give you things I can't. A life in the city, proper schooling, opportunities I can't provide. Lottie considered the question seriously before answering. She might be able to give me those things. But you gave me something more important. You gave me back my voice. Before I came here, I felt invisible, like nothing I said or wanted mattered to anyone. You taught me that my thoughts and feelings had value. She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say next. I know you were afraid to love someone again because of what happened to your first family. And I was afraid to trust anyone because everyone I'd ever loved had left me. But we both took that risk, and look what we found. We found each other. The simple eloquence of her words hit Bram like a physical blow. She'd articulated something he'd been feeling, but hadn't been able to express, that their relationship had required courage from both of them, that they'd chosen to risk love, despite having every reason to protect themselves from further loss. Judge Wells cleared his throat diplomatically. The court will certainly consider your wishes, Miss Lottie, but you should know that Mrs. Carver seems genuinely concerned for your welfare. She's not seeking custody out of malice, but from what she believes is family duty. Have you met her? Lottie asked. I have. She's a refined woman, well-educated, financially secure. She lives in a substantial home in Denver with connections to good schools and cultural opportunities. But does she know me? Does she know that I love to garden? That I'm learning to carve wood, that I like to read by the fireplace in the evenings? Does she know that I was mute for months after my parents died, and that Bram helped me find my voice again? The questions revealed the depth of Lottie's understanding about what truly mattered in relationships. She wasn't rejecting the potential advantages her aunt could offer, but she was insisting that love and understanding mattered more than material benefits. Those are the kinds of things you'll need to explain to the court, Judge Wells said. Both of you will have the opportunity to present your case. After the judge departed, leaving them with legal documents and a court date that felt like an approaching storm, Bram and Lottie sat together on the cabin's front porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The familiar view that had brought Bram peace for over 20 years now felt precious and potentially temporary. "Are you scared?" Lottie asked quietly. "Terrified," Bram admitted. "You?" "Yes, but not of the court hearing." "What then?" "I'm scared of having to leave before the garden is finished. All winter long, I planned what we'd plant together, how beautiful it would be when everything grew. Now I might not get to see it bloom." The practical concern, so typical of Lottie's way of processing large fears through small, tangible details, nearly broke Bram's heart. She wasn't just afraid of being taken away. She was grieving the loss of a future she'd spent months imagining. "We're not giving up," he said firmly. "Whatever happens at that hearing, we're going to fight for this. For us. How? By telling the truth. About what we've built here, about what we mean to each other, but why families shouldn't be defined only by blood." Over the following days, they threw themselves into preparation with the same intensity Lottie had once brought to planning her garden. Bram wrote detailed accounts of their daily life, documenting everything from Lottie's educational progress to her emotional development. He gathered character references from townspeople, testimonials from Dr. Peterson about her health, and evidence of the stable, nurturing environment they'd created together. Lottie, meanwhile, worked on her own contribution to their defense, a journal chronicling her experiences since coming to live with Bram. Her entries revealed a child who had not just survived, but thrived, who had rediscovered joy and security in the most unexpected circumstances. "Listen to this," she said one evening, reading from her journal. "March 15th. Today, Bram taught me to identify different bird calls. He says each species has its own language, and if you learn to listen carefully, you can understand what they're trying to tell you. I think people are like that too. They don't always say what they mean with words, but if you pay attention to other things, you can understand their real feelings." "You wrote that?" Bram asked, amazed by the sophistication of her observation. "I write about everything we do together. About the things you teach me, about how safe I feel here, about how different my life is now compared to before." She looked up from the journal. "Do you think a judge would understand?" "I think any reasonable person would understand. The question is whether the law will allow for what we've created here." Their preparation was interrupted by an unexpected visit from Reverend Morrison, who arrived with news that added another layer of complexity to their situation. "Mrs. Carver is in town," the preacher announced without preamble. "She arrived yesterday and has been asking to meet with Lottie." "What did you tell her?" Bram asked. "That any meetings would need to go through proper legal channels." "But Bram, I think you should know, she's not what you might expect." "What do you mean?" "She's younger than I anticipated, maybe early 30s, and she seems genuinely grief-stricken about her sister's death. Whatever her motives for seeking custody, they appear to come from real family affection rather than duty or social pressure. The information made their situation more complicated rather than clearer. It would have been easier to fight someone motivated by selfish interests than someone driven by legitimate love for her dead sister's child." "Has she asked about me?" Lottie inquired quietly. "She has. She wants to know about your health, your schooling, your general happiness. She also asked about your parents. She seems to want to understand what their life was like before they died." That evening, as they worked together in the garden that had become Lottie's pride and joy, she posed a question that revealed the depth of her internal struggle. "Do you think my mother would want me to live with her sister?" Bram considered the question seriously before answering. "I think your mother would want you to be happy and safe and loved. Whether that's with your aunt or with me, I can't say. But I can tell you this, the choice doesn't have to be between honoring your parents' memory and choosing your own happiness. The two aren't mutually exclusive. What if the judge decides I should go with her?" The question hung in the evening air like smoke from a dying fire. It was the possibility neither of them wanted to acknowledge, but both knew they had to face. "Then we'll accept that decision and be grateful for the time we've had together," Bram said finally. but we'll also make sure the judge understands what he'd be taking away, not just from us, but from you." As the court date approached, their mountain sanctuary took on an almost desperate preciousness. Every shared meal, every evening by the fire, every moment working together in the garden felt like something to be treasured against an uncertain future. The night before they were scheduled to leave for Helena, Lottie surprised Bram by presenting him with something she'd been working on in secret, a wooden carving of remarkable sophistication for someone her age. It was a small bird, wings spread as if in flight, carved from a piece of pine he'd given her months earlier. "I wanted to finish it before—" She paused, unable to complete the thought. Before what? Before everything changes. Win or lose, after tomorrow, nothing will be the same. Bram accepted the carving with hands that weren't entirely steady. The workmanship was extraordinary, showing not just technical skill, but an understanding of form and movement that spoke to real artistic talent. "This is beautiful," he said. "But why a bird?" "Because you taught me that sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that look like they're about to fly away. And because no matter what happens tomorrow, part of me will always be here with you, just like part of you will always be with me." That night, as they packed for the journey to Helena and the hearing that would determine their future, Bram reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 7 months ago, he'd been a man convinced that isolation was the only protection against loss. Now he was preparing to fight for the right to remain connected to someone who had become essential to his understanding of who he was and who he might yet become. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. And regardless of the court's decision, they had already won something precious. They had proven to themselves and each other that love was worth the risk of loss, that families could be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes the most broken people could help heal each other in ways that defied explanation but never failed to inspire wonder. The wooden bird sat on the kitchen table between them as they made their final preparations, its carved wings spread in permanent flight, a reminder that some things were too beautiful to be caged, too precious to be owned, and too powerful to be destroyed by the decisions of others. The territorial courthouse in Helena was an imposing brick structure that seemed designed to humble those who entered seeking justice. As Bram and Lottie climbed the wide stone steps on the morning of their hearing, the weight of official authority pressed down on them like mountain air before a storm. Judge Wells had explained the procedures during their preliminary meeting, but walking into the formal courtroom still felt like entering foreign territory. High windows cast long rectangles of sunlight across polished wooden benches, and the American flag hung beside the territorial seal as silent witnesses to the proceedings about to unfold. Margaret Carver was already seated at one of the council tables, and Bram's first sight of her confirmed Reverend Morrison's description. She was younger than he'd expected, with dark hair similar to Lottie's and the kind of refined bearing that spoke of education and social advantage. When she turned to look at them, her expression showed curiosity rather than hostility, as if she were studying a puzzle she was trying to solve. "That's her," Lottie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you all right? She looks like Mama did when she was younger." "I can see it in her eyes." The observation added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Whatever else Margaret Carver might be, she was a tangible connection to Lottie's lost family, something Bram could never provide. Their attorney, a practical man named Samuel Crawford, whom Judge Wells had recommended, approached their table with final documents and last-minute advice. "Remember," Crawford said quietly, "this isn't about proving that Mrs. Carver would be a bad guardian. It's about proving that your current arrangement serves Lottie's best interests. Focus on the positive, the stability you've provided, the progress she's made, the genuine bond you've formed." "What about her preferences?" Bram asked. "The judge will consider them, but he'll weigh them against other factors: legal precedent, social conventions, long-term considerations. A child's wishes matter, but they're not determinative. As the hearing began, Bram felt the familiar tension of facing odds that seemed stacked against him. But beside him, Lottie sat with the composed dignity that had become her trademark. Her small hands folded in her lap and her attention focused completely on the proceedings. Judge Harrison Wells called the court to order and outlined the matter at hand with formal precision. We are here to determine the custody arrangement that best serves the interests of Charlotte Emma Morrison, age 6, currently under the guardianship of Bram McCready, also known as Bram McCready, with a petition for custody filed by Margaret Emily Carver. Claiming rights as the child's maternal aunt, Mrs. Carver's attorney, a distinguished man from Denver named Patrick Hartwell, presented their case first. His arguments were methodical and compelling, built on legal precedent and social convention. Your Honor, Mrs. Carver represents the child's closest living blood relative. She is a woman of unquestioned moral character, financial stability, and social standing. She can provide Charlotte with educational opportunities, cultural advantages, and connection to her family heritage that a single man living in isolation simply cannot match. Hartwell produced documents establishing Mrs. Carver's credentials, bank statements showing substantial assets, references from prominent Denver citizens, letters from educational institutions detailing the schooling opportunities available to Lottie in the city. Furthermore, the attorney continued, while we don't question Mr. McCready's good intentions, the arrangement lacks the social structure and feminine influence that a growing girl requires. Mrs. Carver can provide Charlotte with the guidance of an experienced woman who knew and loved her. Parents, when called to testify, Margaret Carver approached the witness stand with quiet composure. Her voice was clear and steady as she answered Hartwell's questions about her background, her relationship with Lottie's mother, and her motivations for seeking custody. Elizabeth was my younger sister, she explained. We were very close despite the difference in our ages. When she married Robert Morrison and moved west, I was devastated to lose her companionship. I was traveling in Europe when they died, settling my late husband's business affairs. By the time I returned and learned of the tragedy, Charlotte had already been placed in the territorial orphanage. What are your intentions regarding the child's upbringing? Hartwell asked. To honor my sister's memory by providing Charlotte with every advantage Elizabeth would have wanted for her. The finest education, exposure to culture and refinement, connections with her family history. Most importantly, the love of someone who knew her parents and can help keep their memory alive. Crawford's cross-examination was respectful but pointed. Mrs. Carver, you mentioned being close to your sister despite age differences. How much time did you actually spend with Charlotte before her parents' deaths? We exchanged letters regularly, and Elizabeth sent photographs. I visited once when Charlotte was very young, perhaps 2 years old, so your actual personal knowledge of the child is quite limited. I knew her through her mother's letters. Elizabeth wrote extensively about Charlotte's personality, her interests, her remarkable intelligence. But you have no direct experience of caring for this particular child, or indeed any child. Is that correct? Margaret Carver's composure flickered slightly. I have no children of my own, if that's what you're asking. But I have resources to provide excellent care, and I'm motivated by genuine love for my sister's memory. Let me ask this directly. Mrs. Carver, have you spent any time with Charlotte since learning of her existence? Have you attempted to understand who she is now rather than who she was in her mother's letters 3 years ago? I've been told that such contact should wait for official resolution of custody matters. Crawford nodded and returned to his table, having made his point without seeming to attack a woman whose motivations appeared genuine. When Bram took the stand, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted palpably. His presence commanded attention, not through intimidation, but through the quiet authority of someone who had faced far worse trials than legal proceedings. Crawford led him through the basic facts of how he'd come to be Lottie's guardian, the conditions of their life together, and the progress she'd made in his care. But it was during the more personal questions that Bram's testimony became truly compelling. Mr. McCready, can you describe Charlotte's condition when you first brought her home? She was frightened, silent, and convinced that adults were either indifferent to her welfare or actively harmful. She'd been through the territorial orphanage system, which meant she'd learned not to hope for kindness and not to trust that any situation would last. And how would you describe her now? She's found her voice, literally and figuratively. She speaks her mind, pursues her interests, and approaches life with curiosity rather than fear. She's learned that she has value beyond her usefulness to others. What role do you see yourself playing in her life? Bram was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I'm not trying to replace her parents. No one could do that. But I can offer her something she's never had consistently, the security of knowing that someone chooses to love her, not out of duty or social obligation, but because of who she is. Mrs. Carver can offer educational opportunities and social advantages that you cannot. How do you respond to that? Those things have value, and if Lottie wants them, we'll find ways to provide them. But the most important education she's received has been learning that she matters, that her thoughts, her feelings, her dreams are worth protecting and nurturing. Crawford paused. I then asked the question that would define Bram's testimony. Mr. McCready, what would losing Charlotte mean to you? The question hit like a physical blow, but Bram answered with unflinching honesty. It would mean losing the person who taught me that my heart wasn't as permanently broken as I thought. It would mean losing the chance to be the father I never got to be to my first daughter. But more than that, it would mean Charlotte loses the home where she's learned to trust again, to love again, to believe in her own worth. When Hartwell cross-examined, his questions focused on practical limitations and social conventions. Mr. McCready, you live in complete isolation. How can you provide Charlotte with the social development she needs? We attend church in Cedar Falls every Sunday. She interacts with townspeople, other children, families who've become part of our extended community. But surely you recognize that a single man cannot provide the feminine guidance a growing girl requires. I recognize that Lottie needs role models and mentors of both genders. But I also recognize that she needs someone who sees her as she is, not as a project to be improved or a duty to be discharged. You've presented yourself as a war hero, Mr. McCready, but isn't it true that you've been hiding from society for over 20 years? Doesn't that suggest someone unsuited for raising a child who needs to learn how to engage with the world? The question struck at Bram's deepest vulnerabilities, but his answer revealed growth that surprised even him. You're right that I've been hiding. But Lottie's presence has taught me that isolation isn't strength. It's just another kind of fear. Taking care of her has required me to engage with the world again, to build relationships, to become part of a community. She's made me a better man, not just a more responsible guardian. As the morning session concluded, Judge Wells called for a recess before Lottie's testimony. The weight of what had been said hung heavy in the courtroom air, and Bram knew that everything now depended on a 6-year-old girl's ability to articulate truths that adults seemed determined to complicate. When court reconvened after the lunch recess, the afternoon light slanting through the courthouse windows had shifted, casting different shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Wells called Lottie to the witness stand with the gentle formality reserved for child witnesses. But even his careful courtesy couldn't diminish the weight of the moment. Lottie approached the witness chair with the same composed dignity she'd shown throughout the proceedings. Someone had provided a cushion so she could sit at the proper height, and she arranged herself carefully. Her hands folded in her lap, and her dark eyes focused on Judge Wells with unwavering attention. "Charlotte," the judge began, his voice deliberately gentle, "do you understand why we're here today?" "Yes, sir." "You're trying to decide whether I should live with Bram or with my Aunt Margaret." "That's right. And I want you to know that your feelings and opinions matter to this court. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer them as honestly as you can. Is that all right?" "Yes, sir." Judge Wells consulted his notes briefly. "Let's start with some basic questions. Are you happy living with Mr. McCready?" Yes, sir. Very happy. Can you tell me why? Lottie considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Before I came to live with Bram, I felt like I was invisible. Like nothing I wanted or thought or felt mattered to anyone. But Bram sees me, really sees me. He notices when I'm sad or excited or worried about something. He cares about my ideas and my dreams. What kinds of dreams do you have? I want to grow the most beautiful garden in the mountains. I want to learn to carve wood like Bram does. Maybe make toys for other children who don't have any. I want to read every book in Bram's house and then find more books to read. Those sound like wonderful dreams. Do you feel that Mr. McCready supports these ambitions? He doesn't just support them, he helps make them possible. He taught me to read better, showed me how to plan a garden, gave me tools and taught me to use them safely. But more than that, he made me believe that my dreams were worth pursuing. Judge Wells nodded thoughtfully. Charlotte, you understand that Mrs. Carver is your mother's sister, don't you? Your family? Yes, sir. She can offer you things that Mr. McCready cannot. Schools in the city, opportunities to meet other children, connections to your parents' history. Don't those things appeal to you? Lottie's answer revealed the depth of thought she'd given to this exact question. Those things sound nice, and maybe someday I'd like to experience some of them. But I've learned that the most important thing isn't what opportunities someone can give you, it's whether they love you for who you are right now, not for who they think you should become. Can you explain what you mean by that? At the orphanage, the adults were always trying to make us into better children, quieter, more obedient, less trouble. They didn't seem to like us very much as we were. But Bram likes me exactly as I am. He thinks my questions are interesting, not annoying. He thinks my ideas about gardening are smart, not silly. He makes me feel like I'm already good enough. Crawford rose for his direct examination. His questions designed to let Lottie tell her story in her own words. Lottie, can you describe what a typical day is like at the cabin? We get up early and take care of the animals together, the chickens and horses. Then we have breakfast and I do my lessons. Bram teaches me reading and writing and arithmetic, but also practical things like how to preserve food and identify different plants. In the afternoon, we work on projects, maybe gardening or wood carving or repairing something that's broken. And in the evening, we read together by the fire. That sounds very structured. Do you have time for play? Everything feels like play when you're doing it with someone who enjoys your company. Even chores are fun when Bram explains why we're doing them and teaches me the right way to do them myself. Have you ever felt unsafe or uncomfortable in Mr. McCready's care? Never, not once. The answer was immediate and emphatic. Sometimes I have bad dreams about things that happened before, but when I wake up scared, Bram is always there to help me feel safe again. Lottie, I want to ask you about something difficult. Do you remember your parents? Yes, I remember them. They loved me very much, and I loved them. But they're gone, and nothing can bring them back. How do you think they would feel about your living with Mr. McCready? Lottie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. I think they would be grateful that someone was taking such good care of me. My mother always said that the most important thing was for me to be safe and loved and free to be myself. Bram gives me all of those things. When Hartwell cross-examined, his questions were respectful but probing. Charlotte, you're very articulate for someone your age. Has Mr. McCready coached you on what to say today? He told me to tell the truth about how I feel. That's all. You mentioned bad dreams. What are those dreams about? Lottie hesitated, then answered with characteristic honesty. Sometimes I dream about the night my parents died. Sometimes I dream about being back at the orphanage. But mostly I dream about having to leave the cabin and never seeing Bram again. Which of those dreams frightens you most? The last one. Because losing my parents wasn't my choice, and what happened at the orphanage wasn't my choice. But losing Bram would feel like the world was taking away my choice all over again. Charlotte, Mrs. Carver loved your mother very much. Don't you think she deserves a chance to love you too? I think everyone deserves a chance to love and be loved. But I also think I deserve a chance to stay where I'm already loved, where I've already found my home. But what if the court decides that living with Mrs. Carver would be better for your future? Lottie looked directly at Judge Wells as she answered. Then I would hope that whoever makes that decision understands that taking me away from Bram wouldn't just hurt me, it would hurt him too. And I don't think my parents would want their death to cause more people to lose the ones they love. The simple wisdom of her words seemed to settle over the courtroom like morning mist. Even Hartwell appeared moved by her response, and he concluded his questioning without pushing further. As Lottie returned to her seat beside Bram, Judge Wells called for closing arguments. Crawford spoke passionately about the bonds that had been formed, the healing that had taken place, and the family that had been created through choice rather than blood. Hartwell's closing was equally compelling, focusing on legal precedent, social conventions, and the advantages that Mrs. Carver could provide. But it was Judge Wells's final questions that would determine the outcome. "Mrs. Carver," he said, "having heard Charlotte's testimony, how do you respond to her obvious attachment to Mr. McCready?" Margaret Carver rose slowly, her composure showing signs of strain for the first time. "Your Honor, I came here believing that blood family should take precedence, that I could provide advantages that a single man in the mountains could not. But listening to Charlotte today, hearing her speak with such love and security about her life with Mr. McCready, I realize I may have been thinking more about what I needed than what she needs." The admission sent a murmur through the courtroom. "What are you saying?" "Mrs. Carver, I'm saying that perhaps the question isn't who can provide the most opportunities, but who has already provided the most healing. Charlotte has found her voice, her confidence, her sense of self-worth in Mr. McCready's care. Who am I to take that away from her?" Judge Wells turned to Bram. "Mr. McCready, if the court were to award custody to Mrs. Carver, what would you want for Charlotte?" "I'd want her to know that love doesn't end just because circumstances change. That she's strong enough to build new relationships while honoring old ones. And that she'll always have a home in the mountains if she ever needs one." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "I'm going to recess this court for deliberation. We'll reconvene in 1 hour for my decision." As the courtroom emptied, Bram and Lottie sat together in the silence of uncertainty, holding hands and drawing strength from the bond that had brought them to this moment. Whatever the judge decided, they had spoken their truth with courage and dignity. The rest was in hands more powerful than their own. 1 year later, the morning sun cast golden light across the mountain valley, illuminating a garden that had exceeded even Lottie's ambitious dreams. Rows of vegetables grew in neat abundance beside carefully tended flower beds that painted the landscape in every color imaginable. What had started as a simple plan to bring beauty to abandoned ground had evolved into something that drew visitors from Cedar Falls and beyond, people who climbed the mountain trail just to see what love and determination could create. Together, Bram stood in the cabin doorway, coffee cup in hand, watching Lottie move through her garden with the confident grace of someone completely at home in her world. At 7 years old, she had grown tall and strong, her dark hair catching the morning light as she tended to plants that seemed to respond to her touch with extraordinary vitality. "The climbing roses are ready for their second bloom," she called to him, her voice carrying the excitement that still accompanied each new discovery in her botanical kingdom. "And the tomatoes are going to be the best we've ever grown." Judge Wells's decision that day in Helena had been thorough, thoughtful, and ultimately grounded in what he called the unmistakable evidence of a child who has found not just safety, but genuine happiness. His ruling had awarded permanent custody to Bram while establishing visitation rights for Margaret Carver and Dee Sutton, arrangement that had blossomed into something none of them had anticipated. Margaret had become a regular visitor to the mountain cabin, making the journey from Denver every few months to spend time with Lottie and, increasingly, to form her own bond with Bram. Her initial skepticism about his ability to provide proper guidance for a growing girl had transformed into deep respect for the man who had helped her niece heal from trauma that Margaret herself wouldn't have known how to address. "You were right about the marigolds," Lottie continued, gathering vegetables for their breakfast. Planting them around the tomatoes really does keep the pests away. How did you know that? Your mother taught me, Bram replied, the words coming easily now. He'd learned to speak of Sarah without the sharp edge of grief that had once made such memories unbearable. She had theories about which plants helped each other grow stronger. Over the past year, Lottie had drawn countless stories from him about his first family, gradually weaving their memory into the fabric of their current life, rather than treating the past as something too fragile to touch. She spoke of Sarah as if she'd known her, incorporating the lessons Bram shared about his daughter into her own understanding of how to live well. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their morning routine. Visitors were still uncommon but no longer unexpected. Word of their story had spread through the territory, drawing everyone from curious townspeople to territorial officials who wanted to observe this unconventional family that had somehow made itself work. But this morning's visitors were familiar faces. Reverend Morrison and Dr. Peterson, along with a woman Bram didn't immediately recognize. "Morning, Bram," Reverend Morrison called as they dismounted. "Hope you don't mind the early visit, but we've brought someone who wanted to meet you both." The stranger was a middle-aged woman with intelligent eyes and the kind of practical clothing that suggested someone accustomed to travel. She approached with the confident bearing of someone used to being taken seriously despite working in a world dominated by men. "Mr. McCready." "Miss Lottie," Dr. Peterson said, "I'd like you to meet Miss Eleanor Hartley. She's a journalist from San Francisco writing about families and communities in the territories." A journalist. Bram's wariness was automatic. He'd had enough of outside scrutiny to last several lifetimes. "I'm writing about how people create belonging in places where traditional structures don't always apply," Miss Hartley explained. "Your story has become something of a legend in territorial circles. The war hero who found redemption through caring for an orphaned child. The community that rallied to protect an unconventional family. We're not legends," Lottie said matter-of-factly, wiping soil from her hands on a cloth. "We're just people who found each other and decided to stay together." Miss Hartley smiled at the response. "That might be the most profound definition of family I've ever heard. May I quote you on that?" "I suppose, but I don't understand why anyone would be interested in reading about us." "Because your story gives people hope that love can triumph over legal technicalities, that families can be chosen as well as inherited, that healing is possible even after terrible loss." As they gave Miss Hartley a tour of their mountain sanctuary, Bram found himself seeing their life through her eyes, the comfortable routines they'd developed, the evidence of care and attention in every corner of their home. The garden that represented Lottie's vision, brought to life through their combined efforts. "What strikes me most," the journalist observed as they walked through the flower beds, "is how normal this all feels. Despite the unusual circumstances of how you came together, you've created something that feels completely natural. That's because we stopped trying to fit someone else's definition of what a family should look like," Bram said. "We just focused on taking care of each other." "And what does taking care of each other mean to you?" Lottie answered before Bram could speak. "It means paying attention to what makes each person feel safe and happy and loved. It means making room for everyone to be who they really are, not who someone else thinks they should be." "Do you miss having a mother figure in your life?" Miss Hartley asked gently. "I have lots of mother figures," Lottie replied. "Mrs. Peterson in town, Mrs. Morrison at church, Aunt Margaret when she visits. But having a lot of people who care about you is different from having one person who's responsible for you. Bram is responsible for me, and I'm responsible for him too in my own way. How are you responsible for him?" "I make sure he doesn't get too lonely, that he remembers to eat regular meals, that he doesn't work all the time without having fun. I remind him that being careful isn't the same as being afraid, and that taking care of someone else is what makes life meaningful." The sophistication of her answer clearly impressed Miss Hartley. But it didn't surprise Bram. Over the past year, he'd watched Lottie develop into someone who thought deeply about relationships and responsibility. who understood that love was as much about daily actions as grand gestures. That evening, after their visitors had departed and the dishes from supper were cleaned and put away, Bram and Lottie settled into their familiar routine of reading by the fireplace. But instead of selecting separate books, Lottie brought him the leather-bound journal she'd been keeping since the custody hearing. "I want to read you something I wrote," she said, settling into the chair beside his rocker. "Miss Hartley's questions made me think about how to explain what we have. Here." She opened to a page marked with a pressed flower, one of the first blooms from their garden, and began to read. Aloud, when people ask me about my family, I tell them that families aren't just about blood or marriage or legal papers. Sometimes families are about choice, about people who decide to love each other and take care of each other, even when the world says they don't belong together. Bram chose me when nobody else wanted me. But I chose him too. I chose to trust him when trust was the hardest thing in the world for me. I chose to let him teach me things, to share my thoughts and feelings with him, to make this place our home together. We both lost our first families to violence and tragedy. But instead of letting that loss make us afraid to love again, we decided to build something new, something that honors the people we've lost while making room for the people we've become. I know that what we have is unusual. Most children don't live alone in the mountains with a man who isn't their father or relative. But most children also don't get to help design their own garden, or learn to carve beautiful things from pieces of wood, or spend their evenings reading by firelight with someone who thinks their questions are important. Maybe the most special thing about our family is that we both know how precious it is. We both know what it feels like to lose everything, so we don't take anything for granted. Every ordinary day feels like a gift because we understand how quickly ordinary days can disappear. Lottie looked up from her journal. "Is that too serious for a 7-year-old to think about?" "Not too serious at all," Bram said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's exactly the kind of wisdom that comes from someone who's experienced both loss and recovery. Do you think we'll always be this happy?" The question was one that had occurred to Bram many times over the past year. Life had taught him that happiness was fragile, that circumstances could change without warning, that even the strongest bonds could be tested by forces beyond anyone's control. "I think we'll have challenges," he said honestly. "You'll grow up and want things I can't provide, want to experience parts of the world beyond these mountains. There will be disagreements and difficulties, probably times when we frustrate each other or make mistakes. But I also think we've built something strong enough to survive those challenges. We've learned how to talk to each other, how to work through problems, how to make room for each other to grow and change while still staying connected." Lottie closed her journal and leaned against his shoulder in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Bram, yes? Thank you for bidding on me that day. Thank you for teaching me that broken things can be mended, and that sometimes they're stronger afterward than they ever were before." Outside, night was settling over the mountains with the peaceful quiet that had been Bram's companion for over 20 years. But now that silence felt different, not empty but full, not lonely but complete. The cabin that had once been a refuge from the world had become a celebration of what was possible when two people chose to build something together despite having every reason to protect themselves from further loss. As Lottie drifted off to sleep against his shoulder, Bram reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a terrified child on an auction block to a confident young girl planning next year's garden expansion. From a hermit convinced that isolation was safety to a man who had rediscovered the joy of being needed and valued by someone precious. They had created more than just an unconventional family. They had created proof that love could triumph over circumstance, that healing was possible even after devastating loss, that families defined by choice could be just as strong as those defined by blood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. Lottie was already talking about starting a small business, selling flowers and vegetables to people in Cedar Falls, using the proceeds to buy books and art supplies for expanding her education. Margaret Carver had suggested that Lottie might want to spend part of each summer in Denver, experiencing city life and formal schooling while keeping the cabin as her permanent home. These were good problems to have. The challenges of a child who was thriving rather than merely surviving, who had options because she developed the confidence to pursue her dreams. Whatever the future brought, they would face it as they'd faced everything else, together. As Bram carried Lottie to her bed in the loft, she stirred just enough to whisper, "Don't forget to bank the fire." "I won't forget. And don't stay up too late worrying about things." "I won't." "And Bram?" "Yes? I love you too." The words, spoken in the drowsy contentment of someone completely secure in their world, were worth every moment of uncertainty they'd endured to get to this point. As Bram settled the blankets around her and climbed back down to bank the fire, he realized that Sarah would have liked Lottie very much. Her determination, her kindness, her ability to find beauty in simple things, more than that. He believed Mary would have approved of the man he'd become through caring for Lottie. The rage and guilt that had driven him to the mountains had been transformed into something gentler, but no less powerful. The determination to protect and nurture what was precious, to build, rather than merely endure, to create beauty and meaning even in the aftermath of tragedy. The fire settled into glowing coals as Bram made his final rounds, checking that the animals were secure, that the cabin was properly closed against the mountain night, that everything was ready for another day in their carefully constructed paradise. Before retiring to his own bed, he paused at the kitchen table where Lottie's wooden bird sat alongside his military medal, symbols of their shared journey from loss to healing, from isolation to belonging, from fear to love. Tomorrow they would tend their garden together, work on their various projects, share meals and stories and the thousand small interactions that made up a life lived in partnership. But tonight, as mountain silence settled around their home, Bram McCready, formerly Abraham Thorne, war hero and broken man, fell asleep with the profound contentment of someone who had learned that the greatest victories were often the quietest ones. A child's laughter filling a too-silent house, trust growing stronger than fear, and love proving once again that it was the most powerful force in a world that often seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful and good. In the loft above, Lottie slept peacefully, her repaired doll beside her and dreams of tomorrow's garden blooming in her mind. She was safe, she was loved, and she was home, not just in the cabin nestled among the pines,